Hello everyone and welcome to today's event. I'm Charles Lister, a Senior Fellow and the Director of the Syria and Countering Terrorism and Extremism Programs at the Middle East Institute. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's book talk featuring MEI non-resident scholar Diana Darke, who's also affiliated with our Syria program. Diana recently published a book that's been drawing rave reviews and inviting some controversy, Stealing from the Saracens: How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe. The book traces the Arab and Islamic roots of Europe and the West's architectural heritage. It explores how ideas and styles from Middle Eastern centers like Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo made it into Europe and even the US via Muslim Spain, Venice, and Sicily. This week marks the US launch of the book by Hearst Publishers and Oxford University Press, so I hope everyone will consider picking up a copy on www.hearstpublishers.com after our event. You can also use the code Saracens25 to get a 25% discount. And I gather our MEI staff here will be sharing those details on the chat function on Zoom shortly. We're really fortunate to have Diana among our roster of Syria experts. Diana is a Middle Eastern cultural expert and Syria specialist who's lived and worked in the Middle East and Turkey for over 30 years. She is the author of many books, including My House in Damascus and The Merchant of Syria. Moderating today's discussion is Chris Doyle, the director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding, a London-based non-profit that promotes conflict resolution, human rights, and civil society in the Arab world. Thank you so much to the both of you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to listening in on your conversation. Now, just a few quick housekeeping notes before I turn the program over to Chris. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screens. For those of you calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can also ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. And also, if you have any technical issues, you can also email that address, which I'll say again is events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. Chris will be taking a look at your questions as they come in and will factor as many of them in as possible into the discussion. And at this point, I'll pass over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today and perhaps to distract us all from the rather nerve-wracking process that is going on elsewhere. But hopefully we'll have something rather inspiring and uplifting for you all today. So big thank you for the Middle East Institute for inviting me to do this. My name is Chris Doyle, as Charles said, and I run CARBU, the Council for Arab-British Understanding, an NGO devoted to improving the understanding of the Arab world. And one area of this touches on the subject matter of Diana Darke's book, how indeed over many centuries this extraordinary knowledge transfer took place between the Middle East and Europe, and how in fact we have so much more in common than many people believe. We did actually an opinion poll in Britain in 2017 that showed somehow only 25% of those who were polled saw the region of the Middle East, the Near East, as being rich in history. Well, this book, a very detailed account indeed, serves as a very powerful corrective to that. So Diana, a very, very warm welcome. You've written a great deal about Syria and indeed about your own personal story in terms of having your own house in Damascus, which I think probably started you on this journey. What inspired you to write this book? What motivated you? And, I think some people might ask also, why stealing from the Saracens rather than, say, borrowing from the Saracens? What was the grand plan?
Right. Okay. Well, you're slightly jumping ahead of my first slides, actually, my images that I'm going to show you, because that would be explained. But just in a nutshell, the controversial title, which has been very deliberately chosen, the word stealing, very, very deliberate choice, is because the Arabic saraka, to steal, so sarikin are thieves, people who steal, is one of the common derivations. And so we called Arab Muslims thieves when actually we took things from them. That's the kind of double irony of the title. And the thing that made me want to write the book was the fire at Notre Dame, because I suddenly realized, my goodness, most of the world simply doesn't understand the backstory of European architecture. So I set out on a huge journey, really, to sort of show that to a wider audience in what I hope is a very accessible form in this book.
Well, it is very accessible and it covers a great deal of ground. Do you want to start off then with your slides and let's take us through this great story?
Right. So this is by way of introduction to the cover of the book. So Chris has just asked me about the title, Stealing from the Saracens. So that's stealing from the people who we called thieves. And the word Saracens was in popular use centuries ago. And in particular, Christopher Wren, the most famous English architect, who designed St. Paul's, which is the dome you see there on the right, that he back in the 16th century said that what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style, and he reached that conclusion right at the end of his life, after and he lived to be 90, so he had decades of experience, and this was his considered judgment. So the book, in a way, explores Christopher Wren's theory, which is why for the cover we chose the interior of the dome of St. Paul's. So that circle there is the oculus in the center of the dome, because Christopher Wren himself said that he used what he called Saracen vaulting in the dome. So again, as Chris already asked me, the reason why I wrote the book was the fire at Notre Dame. The world was transfixed by this event. The whole of the French nation went into mourning. And it was a great cry of, this building represents our national identity. Our national identity is going up in flames, great consternation. And yet, France is meant to be this secular nation of laicity. And so it struck me as very strange that that there was zero acknowledgement of the backstory of Gothic architecture. So this is what I set out to illustrate in the book. So the book begins with Christopher Wren and then leads you in a sort of chronological fashion through all the elements which go to make up Gothic cathedrals. And then on the right-hand side here, this decapitated saint who is holding his own head, this is Saint Denis, who is the patron saint of France. And I put him there. He is on the facade of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And I'm put him there to illustrate what a muddle there was in the Middle Ages about the identity of this Denis. It turns out there are three Denises. There's this Denis, the patron saint of France, who's from the 3rd century. And then there was a very influential book that was written called The Celestial Hierarchy by somebody who was claiming to be a disciple of St. Paul. And this book was incredibly influential. But centuries later, it was discovered that this book was a fraud, and it was in fact not written by the disciple of Paul at all, but written by the 5th century Syrian monk who was also called Denis. So this is one of the first of the sort of really almost funny sort of confusions and misunderstandings and misinterpretations and mistaken identities which litter this story, actually, because of course people didn't have the internet. They couldn't just find out all this stuff. So a lot of assumptions were made, and sometimes it was, for political reasons, actually, it was just more convenient to conflate identities if it made your own abbey rather more important. So this kind of thing happened throughout. So Syrian Denis, as I call him in the book from this point onwards, he is a late 5th century monk, and he takes us to Syria. So here in this picture, we have what is known today as the Dead Cities, which are in Idlib province, rebel-held Idlib province. The war is still ongoing there, but incredibly, there in the wild hills west of Aleppo, you have the world's biggest concentration of early Christian architecture. This is from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. So this is the earliest extant architecture that we have that shows the transition from Roman pagan architecture towards the early Christian architecture. And so it's an immense treasure trove. And you can see all the buildings there are made of white limestone. And among these buildings, there are 2,000 churches. So an incredible field of experimentation, basically, that was going on in early Christian architecture. And of these churches, the most famous ones, the one on the left is called Kalblause, which is the best preserved of the churches that have this twin towers flanking a monumental entrance, which was designed for pilgrims to feel that they'd arrived somewhere special on their pilgrimage route. And the place they were heading to on this pilgrimage route was St. Simeon's Basilica, which is the picture on the right there, which was the Santiago de Compostela of its day. It was the most important shrine in Christendom because of St. Simeon himself, who preached from the top of this pillar. St. Simeon Stylites, he was called. So Greek for pillar is stylos. And all that remained of his pillar is that little stump that you can see there. And even that, I'm afraid, was blown to smithereens in 2016 by Russian airstrikes. But I cannot overstate how important this was in the days of early Christianity. And then, of course, when the first Muslims came into Syria, and when I say Syria, I'm talking historic Syria for these purposes. So that means the Roman province of Syria. So from which of course stretched in those days from the Taurus Mountains right down to the Sinai. So essentially the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. So what we call the Holy Land, if you like, was Syria in those days. In the Gospel of St. Luke, it even says when Quirinius was governor of Syria. That's when the census took place, when Jesus's birth. So when the Muslims came and made Damascus their capital, they inherited a huge amount, obviously, of earlier Roman, Greek, and Byzantine architecture, which they blended into something different. And the first sort of political statement building that the Umayyads built was the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Abdul Malik, the Caliph, built it in 690. And it was a statement to the Christians, we have arrived, we are the new power here. Because, again, this is quite amusing, but when the Muslims first came into Syria, the local Christians didn't fully appreciate that this was a completely new religion. They actually thought they were just another sect. And to begin with, Muslims actually worshipped in churches and cathedrals alongside Christians. They actually shared the buildings quite regularly, all the way across Syria. And the Dome of the Rock, as you can see from the architecture here, is a sort of blend of Byzantine architecture, but all the decoration is on the outside, and that is unique. In Byzantine architecture, all the mosaics and decoration is on the inside. The exterior walls tend to be quite plain. And here we have the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which is another incredibly important early example of Islamic art. And again, you can see how blended it is. It's adopted the Byzantine dome. It's taken the gable there from the Hellenistic shape of temples. And the minaret there is actually called the Jesus minaret. And because, there's a local blending of legends between Christian and Muslim, that Christ will descend from that minaret on the day of judgment. So all these blendings are just normal in Syria. The interaction is on a very, very deep level. Now, this is a detail of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, to show you again this blending and how early Islamic art absorbed what was there before, but synthesized it into something new. So you can see there the triple arch is adopted from the churches that they'd have seen all over Syria. So that's representing the Trinity, but they've absorbed it in here. They've taken the classical columns that they would have seen in all the Hellenistic temples scattered across Syria, like Palmyra. And then they've used Byzantine craftsmen to make the mosaics, but the representations are blended and different to anything that came before. And over on the left there, that is a detail of the interior of the Dome of the Rock, where for the very first time we see architecturally little trefoil arches, little three-lobed arches, which are very, very significant. The first time that they appear. Byzantine architecture did not have any trefoil arches. Another innovation in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus is these geometric window grills for the first time, and they become very influential. We see them all over Europe. On the right there, that's just one of the many examples in St. Mark's in Venice, but they're very widespread across Europe once you start looking for them. And the Umayyads also had very distinctive secular architecture in their palaces. And this gateway here, this is an Umayyad palace in Syria called Qasr al-Hayr al-Gharbi, and it was deconstructed and then reconstructed here in Damascus to form the main gateway of the Damascus National Museum back in the 1930s. And if you look at the detailing of some of these early palaces, this one is from the Mashata Palace, which is which you can actually see in Berlin in the Museum of Islamic Art. You can just see the detailing there, the incredible skill of stonemasonry, the kind of effusiveness almost of it. It's just bursting with life and detail and exuberance and fertility and fecundity everywhere. And another innovation in these palaces, which are scattered over what is today Syria and Jordan, and this particular one is called Khirbat al-Mafjar, and it's in what is today the occupied West Bank near Jericho. And there, the excavators found the example of what people think is probably the very first rose window, because this was designed to be high up in the palace and to let in a kind of decorative light, which then gradually, over many centuries, of course, evolved to the absolute perfection of this example of the rose window in Chartres Cathedral in France. And these early rose windows are meant to represent the sun and the light and rays of light. So now we move to Spain. This is an aerial shot of the Cordoba Mesquita, because when the Umayyads, when their dynasty came to an end with the Abbasids in 750, and they moved their capital east to Baghdad, one Umayyad prince escaped. The rest were basically killed, but one escaped and made his way across North Africa into Spain and set up, if you like, Syria in Spain. I mean, he tried to recreate everything that he had known in Damascus in Spain. And so you see all these early Umayyad features recreated in Spain. And so here, and this is one of the extensions of the Cordoba Mesquita, because it was added to over the centuries. And by the 10th century, this incredible ribbed vaulted ceiling, one of the very earliest examples of ribbed vaulting, which was examined for the first time in 2017 by architectural engineers. They got special permission to go in, and they were astonished. They were completely flabbergasted to find such an incredible example of geometric perfection, and it has never needed structural repair in its entire 1,000-year existence. And this is because of the supreme skill with geometry of the stonemasons, the Muslim stonemasons. At the back of the Cordova Mesquita, there is even a whole wall devoted to the masons' marks, where you can see the names of the masons, and from their names you can see that the majority of them are Muslim. There are Christians mixed in, and just a small number of Jews as well, but it is overwhelmingly Muslim. This is the mihrab of the Cordova Mesquita, and you can see the trefoil arch now is developed more. And so that row, this arcade of them, again, this is a very Umayyad feature, these arcades, rows and rows of arches. The trefoil arch in the most sacred part of the mosque, so very, very significant. And this is also the Cordova Mesquita, the series of arcaded arches forming the main prayer hall, which is a sort of huge web of complexity there, where you have no beginning and no end. You have no sense of where you are in the building. And on the right is one of the exterior gates, where again you can see this incredible love of arches, trefoil arches at the top, a row, and the horseshoe arch, which has been developed. And then inside, in the Cordova Mesquita, these get extended to cinquefoil arches, so that's with 5 lobes. And of course, now that the building has become a cathedral, it has crucifixes rather sort of incongruously put in the middle of all these arches. And multifoil arches then, where you've got lots of lobes, except that this picture now is actually in the synagogue in Cordova, because interestingly, the Jewish community from choice adopted the Muslim styles, the Islamic architecture, as a preference, in fact. And when they were also evicted from Spain, they chose to build their synagogues in Islamic styles. So probably the most famous example is the one in Berlin. Now, another route apart from Muslim Spain that these Islamic features found their way into Europe is through the trading cities of Italy. So this one is Amalfi, the Cathedral of Amalfi, which the merchants there were trading with Cairo and many cities, ports in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in Cairo, they noticed the pointed arches in the Ibn Tulun Mosque. And they liked that style very much and brought it back and copied it in their cathedral. And then a visiting abbot, very powerful Benedictine abbot from Monte Cassino, came to Amalfi and saw the pointed arches and liked it very much and decided he wanted it for his abbey as well. And then the abbot of Cluny, the most powerful Benedictine monastery, also saw these styles and copied them as well. And they not only copied the style, they imported the labor, the craftsmen, and the raw materials in some cases. So and what they discovered then was that the pointed arch was actually stronger as well. So this led to a whole sort of accidental series of where height suddenly became very important. And now here you have the styles as they start to move into France. So here you have this Syrian ablak, as it's called, this sort of striped arches of the different colors. We saw it with red and white in Cordoba, because red and white were the colors of Abdurrahman, the first Umayyad prince. And in this, this is the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Le Puy in France. There's even Kufic script is copied, as well as the actual architectural styles, because people thought, because they'd seen it in the Holy Land, as they called it, they thought this was the language of Christ. They didn't realize that it was Arabic, and so they just copied it, thinking it was holy script. And this, again, this is another one of these amusing examples, the very, very influential pictorial map of Jerusalem. This dates from 1486. And it's a picture, if you like, of Jerusalem as the Christians in Europe would have liked it to be, because it conveniently completely shows no sign of the Muslim rule of the time, which was under the Mamluks. And yet what it shows, right center stage, is the Dome of the Rock, mistaking it for a Christian shrine. They completely don't understand that it is actually the very first Muslim shrine, but they mistake it for the Temple of Solomon. And so it becomes very influential in many churches across Europe, copied with this circular style. We have the Temple Church in London, and there are several churches of that sort scattered all over Europe. Now in Venice, of course, Venice adopts the arch with huge enthusiasm. Again, this is through trading links. Venice very consciously loved Islamic architecture. So you've got trefoil arches, you've got pointed arches, you've got the telephone dial system there. You see that circular area there. This is the Palazzo Dario on the left. That's copied from a Mamluk palace in Cairo. And then on the left, on the right, you've got the Doge's palace with, again, this very intricate, delicate work, and the red and white patterning of the red Verona marble and the white Istrian stone in patterns that have been identified as coming from Seljuk buildings that the traders would have seen when in their trade with the Black Sea. Now, this very delicate, this is something that we very much associate with Islamic architecture. In fact, Wren himself, one of the things he said that, it's ridiculous to call it Gothic. The heavy Goths couldn't possibly have made these kinds of very delicate things. He says, from the lightness of its work, the excessive boldness of its elevations, delicacy, profusion, and extravagant fancy of its ornaments, it could only be attributed to the Moors, or, what is the same thing, to the Arabians or the Saracens. That's what he says. And this cathedral on the left is Burgos, which is also on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. And on the right-hand side, you have the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, which is obviously a very Gothic revival cathedral, completely unique. And Gaudi himself openly admitted to being influenced by Islamic architecture. He loved the sort of organic, the lack of right angles. I mean, he said, nature has no right angles. We shouldn't seek to recreate that. And so this is still unfinished, the Sagrada Familia. It's due to be completed in 2026, which will be the centenary of Gaudi's death. And it's a wonderful example of a sort of multicultural building. The team of people still working on it now come from all corners of the globe, and the materials are brought in from all corners of the globe as well. And now, just to end with a few slides of America, since obviously we're talking about America as well at the moment, and this is the US launch. You in New York have your own unfinished Gothic cathedral in the form of St. John the Divine, except the difference being that it probably never will be finished, unlike the Sagrada Familia. And of course, Gothic is incredibly popular, as I discovered, across America. I mean, no country in the world has more Gothic in its schools and colleges and universities than America. And so here, Yale is an almost entirely Gothic campus, and you've got the Harkness Tower there on the left, and on the right, you've got the main library, which looks like a Gothic cathedral inside. So this style is recreated everywhere in the States as well. And stained glass is another field where all of these styles and techniques came out of Syria. I mean, Syria was the world leader in glass, not only the techniques, but also the raw materials. And the form of plant ash, soda plant ash that Syria produced was reckoned to be the best. I mean, even when the Venetians took it over after Tamerlane destroyed the Syrian glass industry, the Venetians became the top dogs in the glass world, but they still insisted on the cinders of Syria, as they called them, because they knew that that was the best quality. And these stunning colors too on the left-hand side there, of a real early piece of stained glass, the alchemy of that, how to create these colors, all of that was the techniques and styles and skills were all developed in Syria. And on the right-hand side there, you have a modern stained glass. So even now, this is again in Yale University, you're recreating these styles and painting of enamel paint onto stained glass, onto windows, the technique of that, enameling of glass, all of that came out of Damascus. Heraldry is another very interesting one. I wasn't expecting to find this one when I was doing my researches, but the Crusaders, when they went off on the first crusade, they saw the Saracens, shall we call them, on the fields, on the plains of Syria, having jousting competitions with blunt javelins, and they were wearing on their helmets symbols. So that lion and the first fleur-de-lis was actually on the helmet of Nur-ad-Din. And so when the Crusaders liked this idea of having, you know, a particular symbol on your helmet that would represent you, and so they brought the idea back into Europe and developed it into the whole heraldic system, which of course you in America have also adopted with Yale. And here you have, you know, the Yale on the right-hand side there, the mythical beast, which again originated in Nubia or Ethiopia, is meant to represent proud defense, and he gets incorporated into the Yale coat of arms. And then finally, the Capitol dome. We're back to the dome again, like where we started, where Christopher Wren used the Saracen vaulting and the Islamic double dome, as it was called, where you have the different exterior profile to the interior. And your Capitol dome in Washington, D.C. uses this double dome technique, where the inner dome has its own profile from the inside. Then you have a hollow space, and then you have the outside one, which is to project a much more imposing profile on the skyline. And it's interesting, I think, that the early presidents decided to model Washington on a sort of Greek system, if you like, where they consciously modeled it on the Greek ideals of proportion, which they thought would be highly suitable for a fledgling democracy. And I think, given where we are now with the American elections, the fact that this is your parliament, this building, I think this is a suitable point at which to stop and just hand over now. Back to Chris.
Chris, Charles here, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Diana. So sorry I was on mute. That was absolutely terrific and very insightful. Just to remind everybody that you can put questions in the Q&A. Be grateful if they're clear and short, and we shall try to get everybody into this lively discussion about, I think, what everyone can agree is a great subject. And I'll just remind you, the book here, a fantastic cover, as Diana showed you, is available from Hearst Books today, and there's a discount code as well. I think Diana has that. So do get it. It's very worthwhile. But I was going to kick off with a few questions whilst we await some of yours in the Q&A. I think that strikes so many people, I think, Diana, is how unaware in the 21st century we all are, in the West, in the English-speaking world at least, of a lot of this, the debt that we owe to other cultures in the building of, you know, great cathedrals like Notre Dame. And indeed, the British Parliament is another one. You mentioned the US Congress, but our own Parliament here in London is influenced as well. Why do you still think there is this reluctance to acknowledge it and embrace it? Because it does actually have a very powerful message that, you know, we do share so much in common, and we did have this great knowledge transfer.
Yes, well, I mean, I can only speak, from the basis of my own education, if you like. And I was brought up as a child to feel, all my history was basically teaching me that Europe was the center of the universe, and that, you know, Greece and Rome invented everything. And really, there was no attempt to look further east at all. And so, I mean, I come from a sort of European background. My mother's German, my father's a German academic. And so as a child, I traveled widely in Europe and absorbed all of this. I was of the generation that watched Kenneth Clarke's series on the television of Civilization. And Civilization, as defined by Kenneth Clarke, was Europe, basically. There was nothing better than Europe as the pinnacle. And it was only when I switched to Arabic at university that I, began to travel beyond, east of Greece for the first time, that I began to realize, my goodness, actually the Greeks got most of their ideas from further east. And so it goes on, everything goes further and further east. So you get to the cradle of civilization, which is between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where so many things were invented. But then you also have India, of course, provides a lot of innovation as well. I mean, so there's been this constant blending that went on, and yet somehow I think a lot of people are still stuck in a mentality that Europe is the center, and so we developed this language of East and West, which isn't helpful, frankly. I mean, we should try to stop thinking in those terms of East and West. It creates divisions and culture wars, which, when you look objectively at the architecture, for example, as a physical example of everything that we share, you can see how blended all these things are, and how all the ideas have been taken and then reused and passed backwards and forwards. So, it is a huge melting pot. Everything is blended, and cultures interact and interweave in ways that challenge all these assumptions we make about our history. So I do think, reforming the education syllabus would be a good place to start, actually. I think it's beginning to happen, but these things are very slow. They take a long time to get going.
It certainly does. For those who didn't know it, Kenneth Clarke's Civilization was a very famous BBC series, I think in the 1960s, I think.
Yeah.
But I mean, I reviewed his work recently, could find hardly anything relating to architecture outside of culture, indeed, outside of Europe. Very Eurocentric. So I think this is an ongoing problem. You've done a great job in trying to highlight exactly how misleading this is. We talk about some of the entry points today, and just to give viewers and listeners a sort of sense, I mean, you mentioned some of the entry points like Venice, Amalfi in Spain. You could have mentioned so many others. Sicily comes to mind as well. I mean, which ones do you think were the most influential?
Without doubt, Muslim Spain was the most influential, and the earliest, of course, because that was happening centuries before. So the first trefoil arches were appearing in the Cordova Mesquita on European soil. It took then another century before they start to appear in Gothic cathedrals. And the same with the ribbed vaulting. The ribbed vaulting appears a whole century earlier in Muslim Spain than it does in Gothic cathedrals. But yes, you've got Cyprus, obviously, as well. You've got Malta, all these trading points. But yes, Sicily is another very major one, obviously, where a lot of research, funnily enough, has been done recently, which shows that the craftsmen on the Cappella Palatina there in Palermo were Muslims who had come from Fatimid Cairo. They'd been trained in Fatimid Cairo, and so they came into Sicily, and their skills obviously were then gradually passed over to the local Christian craftsmen, and this kind of transfer of skills went on a lot, and it went on a great deal after the Crusades. I mean, increasingly evidence is coming to light that shows that a lot of Muslim craftsmen moved with the Crusaders back. You know, and there's evidence of a few of them that made it here. I mentioned one of them in the book, actually, who ends up becoming the architect of one of our King Henrys. You know, I mean, so incredibly influential. And of course, he then teaches our local English masons how to do these things, because it takes generations and generations to learn all of these things. And it tends to be, you know, you use the local materials. So the reason Syrian stonemasons are so skilled so early on is because Syria is covered in stone, you know, white limestone and black basalt. So this is the local building material. So this is what you become very skilled in. The Abbasids in Baghdad didn't have stone; they just had mud brick. So they were having to use brick designs. So their skills developed differently. But the stonemasonry techniques were very much in Syria. I mean historic Syria. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's very striking when you wrote about La Mezquita that it was built in only a year, and you already mentioned that it's structurally so sound, that ribbed vaulting. That's a real testament to the quality. We have now some questions coming in. So there's a question from Vincent Campos. How can Islamic architecture's influence on the West be transformed into a teaching tool for cultural understanding, tolerance, and appreciation?
Well, I would have thought that, you know, some imaginative people could easily develop, you know, teaching modules about this. I mean, the beauty of architecture is it's so physical, it's so tangible, everybody can see it, you know, and the minute you have your eyes opened to some of the detailing on these designs, I mean, your eye becomes trained. And that's very, very good for children, actually, to learn to notice detail on buildings and to identify things. And you know, rather than just sort of glancing at a building and not thinking about it at all, you know, if you just look at pretty much any you know, parish church in this country, you'll start to notice so many styles. I mean, I've got one locally here where I live. It is. I look at it now and I see Syria in all the arches and in the stained glass. There's a very early stained glass window just up the road, one of the very earliest, and I know that glass came from Syria. And to me, that enriches my appreciation of what we've got here in the country. You know, it's wonderful to see that so many centuries ago, all these influences were finding their way over, and that's what enriches everything. I mean, multiculturalism is what makes us creative and inventive, and I think we really need to embrace that. And children really need to be shown, have their eyes opened to the benefits of multiculturalism.
I couldn't agree more, and it's certainly something we're trying to do in this country to open up children's minds to these things. Mark, we do a lot of talks at schools on these sorts of issues. Now, we have some other questions from Mark Stanfield. How receptive is archaeology, architecture, and/or academia been with your book so far? Do these insights and updates to the world's understanding of what's been understood as Gothic architecture sort of rock the boat, or has this caused others to fall in step and pay proper respect to the Middle Eastern origins for the architecture so many adore?
Well, that is a very relevant question, because people have been falling into two camps, basically. And again, it comes back to what I mentioned a little earlier about it depends on your standpoint. You know, we are all to an extent products of our education and our environment. And so people, and I tend to find this actually in older people. So older people who have been educated in a particular mold don't like it, basically. They don't like the suggestion that Europe was not responsible for everything. And they really get quite heated about it. And there are actually, believe it or not, and this is something, again, I've only learnt through doing the book, there are people, Twitter accounts, you know, these white supremacists, essentially, masquerading as architectural heritage Twitter accounts, trying to push messages of, here you look, isn't this wonderful? Look, and it's quite subtle, but it's actually very nasty because it plays on people's sort of preconceptions, and what we need to be doing is the complete opposite of that. We need to be opening up people's minds to the possibilities of further expansion. So yes, there has been criticism, but to my enormous relief, academia itself has actually welcomed the book, and that is wonderful, because my original Arabic professor actually read my manuscript. This is at Oxford. I mean, he's now retired, but he offered to read my manuscript. A lot of what I say in the book is using the incredibly detailed research of earlier scholars who are specialists in one particular field or another. So, for example, Venice. So the architectural historian professor at Cambridge, Deborah Howard, spent 10 years of her life writing an amazing book called Venice and the East. And so she did all the hard work, if you like. She researched all of this and traced where all these things come from. And so I just get to read her book, and that forms part of this huge circular jigsaw that I'm putting together. On Umayyad art, the early excavations that were taking place, this is before the creation of Israel, actually. So a lot of these palaces were, readily accessible in a way that is now quite tricky. So Khirbat al-Mathjar near Jericho was the subject of intensive excavations by a wonderful archaeologist called Robert Hamilton, who is sadly dead now. But he, again, spent decades of his life researching all of this and cataloguing it all. And so I can come along, look at his books and join the dots, really. I mean, so all these little stepping stones of the work of earlier academics is there already. You just have to look for it. And then somebody like me, who has sort of familiar with Europe and has a sort of big picture view of the Middle East, can come along and join the dots. And if you like, that's what I've done. And I think an academic probably wouldn't do that because it's too broad for an academic. Most academics have a particular specialism, and so that's what they focus on. So this is taking a very broad view, but thank goodness, obviously there are little quibbles here and there from people. I mean, especially about the early Christian stuff. Actually, it's amazing how much of the early Christian stuff again gets people quite heated under the collar. But on the whole, the academic community is delighted that I've actually put all this together in an accessible form.
Well, it is accessible, and I think you are in a way to sort of cite Isaac Newton standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's part of the message of the whole book, isn't it? Really,
yeah.
That things develop. And we've got a question along this lines, I think, from Susan Abadian, who apologized for missing the first part of your talk, but she was. She says, I so appreciate you encouraging the Western world to appreciate how much they've absorbed from Islamic art. But wouldn't you say it's important to also appreciate that Islamic art was a product of pre-Islamic Iran, which was Zoroastrian?
Absolutely, yes. And that's why, early on in the book, a lengthy chapter is devoted to what is called the pre-Islamic inheritance. And so, indeed, Islamic art built on many earlier influences from the Sassanids in Iran, and so all of these things again have been traced by earlier scholars. So it's quite relatively simple for me to come along and read their work and draw that in. Now in this book, because of course I'm mainly talking about Islamic art and the movement of it to the West, it would need to be a separate book almost, talking about what the influences on Islamic art were further east. And I mean, books have been written about the Buddhist influences on Islamic architecture, for example. So, there is actually work being done on all of this. The trouble is it tends to be rather inaccessible and in learned journals where you have to go and dig it out and try and sort of put it into context a bit. But absolutely, you're dead right. I mean, Iran has been hugely influential, and I mean, sometimes openly so. So, for example, the arts and crafts movement with William Morris and people like that. I mean, they very much talked about Persian designs, openly recognizing that their work is entirely derivative from Persian designs, which found their way gradually westwards via Islamic routes.
We have a question from Jessica Davies. Are the skills of the Saracen architects still alive today? Are there craftsmen who can repair these ancient buildings like St. Simeon's that you mentioned? Obviously, a lot of the sites that you cover in your book are in modern day Syria, and we've seen that for the last 9 years it's gone through this crisis. What is the extent of the damage to the churches in the dead cities and elsewhere? Dura Europos, the first church perhaps ever. What can you tell us about how the reconstruction process might go, rehabilitation?
Yeah, I mean, this is deeply tragic. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, Dura Europos, the first house church, Dura Europos sadly has been horrifically plundered during the war. Satellite photos of it just show it's a series of pits that have been dug by, people digging for treasure and illicit trafficking then. But in terms of the damage, the worst of the damage obviously is in Aleppo. I mean, Aleppo has suffered the worst of it. I mean, from constant shelling, Russian and Assad regime shelling. But most of the good news is that a lot of it is not as badly damaged as you might think. A few buildings have been. And again, all of this has been recorded, incidentally. Very, very diligent people, both inside and outside Syria, are busy recording the damage and have recorded it as it happened throughout the war. So you can go to websites and find out exactly what the state of damage is in any specific building that you care to look up. It's all catalogued there. So the good news is that a lot of it is relatively superficially damaged, so it can be repaired. The problem is, of course, that in the last 9 years, most of the craftsmen have been scattered. A lot have been killed. A lot have become refugees and are now in Europe working as taxi drivers or whatever. Obviously not using their skills at all. There are relatively few stonemasons left inside Syria. There are some. I mean, I have restoration architect friends who are still inside Syria and still working. I mean, the Aga Khan Foundation, for example, is still present inside Syria, and because it's an apolitical, neutral institution, it carries on with its work. So it's been restoring some of the souks in Aleppo, for example. But of course, it is a very tragic picture. And another one of the reasons actually for writing the book, I mean, I never try to brush the war under the carpet. I mean, when the war is relevant in what I'm talking about, I always mention it because I think people deserve to know what the current condition of some of these places is. It's important that people understand that these buildings, the dead cities in particular, are still very, very exposed to damage. So yeah, I wish more was being done to highlight this, because I think if people understood the level of the sort of almost casual damage that's being done through aerial bombardment, when these things aren't military targets. I mean, there's absolutely no reason to be bombing these places, but sadly, damage does happen, and obviously some of it has been from ISIS and what happened in Palmyra. and that is deeply, deeply tragic as well. But people say a lot of it can be restored.
Diana, just to summarize one or two questions, what was uniquely Islamic about some of the architectural inventions as opposed to things that were built on from earlier civilizations, Byzantium or elsewhere? What did his Muslim architects specifically bring to this process?
Well, from what I learnt, the pointed arch is most definitely an Abbasid invention, and the pointed arch is stronger. And so once that comes into Europe, and as I mentioned, it comes into Cluny at the Benedictine Abbey, and once people realize that it is structurally stronger, this means you can build taller and higher. So this is how Gothic cathedrals start becoming taller and taller, and the windows get bigger and bigger, and it becomes a sort of competition amongst the bishops to see who can have the taller cathedral, until you get to the point where Beauvais Cathedral has gone so extreme that it falls down. I mean, flying buttresses had to be invented in order to hold up these constructions. So the pointed arch, which the Muslims didn't use to do height in the way that the Gothic architects did with it, but the trefoil arch seems to be an Umayyad invention. It didn't appear before that. I can't find it anywhere before that. The Byzantines certainly didn't have it, and yet it's all over Gothic cathedrals. It's all over all our neo-Gothic buildings. It's all over the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben. I mean, and then the ribbed vaulting. The ribbed vaulting, where the ribs are the structure, and they make the ribs decorative. And so that example in the Cordoba Mesquita is again, that the skills of that, the understanding of geometry, that is all completely new. Europe didn't have that knowledge. I mean, Romanesque doesn't have that kind of skill, where the walls are much thicker. It's a completely different style. Without the knowledge and skills that came in with these Islamic inventions, Gothic couldn't possibly have come into being. I mean, obviously it synthesized everything in a different way to create Gothic, but all the different elements were taken from, or borrowed from, but that's the way it is. Everything builds on everything else, and so it's really about acknowledging that.
Absolutely. Now we have a very interesting comment from Maria Mariani, who is from a town in Puglia called Lucera, that has a castle belonging to the Emperor Frederick II. And she is just putting in a comment, but I'll just point people to it, that the emperor brought 20,000 Sicilian Muslims to Lucera. The settlements have thrived for 75 years, fortified town with 4 entrances, or porta, that were very much in Arabesque in style. So I don't know if you went to Puglia in the research for your book, but she says also it had a mosque and a Quranic school. So that's just another story, amongst many, of course, that is out there about these influences. And as one final one, really, for you, Diana, because you did write your book, My House in Damascus. So Joshua Hellinger is just asking, does the house in Damascus still exist?
Absolutely, it does. Yes, it completely does. It's very, it's well and healthy. Thank you. It has not suffered any damage at all. The old city of Damascus has basically not been damaged. Obviously, a completely different story in Aleppo, but no, it's been incredibly, useful. Basically, I'm so glad that it's been able to serve as a sanctuary for refugee families during the war. It's now lived in by just one friend, who is in fact himself a restoration architect. So that is, a wonderful thing. And I still dream of the day when, in future, I hope we can turn it into some sort of cultural centre, where perhaps, studies can take place, where all these links between cultures can be examined and studied more. Because believe me, there is so much more to study. I mean, the more I look, the more I find. I mean, the example you just mentioned from Puglia, I didn't know about that. That's terrific. I mean, I want more people to come forward with all this knowledge, so that you know, we can put it together, and I can put it in the next edition of the book, you know, because there is still so much that needs to come out. Actually, there's only more and more.
I would heartily echo that, and just to remind you that the book Stealing from Saracens is available from Hurst, and it is meant to be available also from the American distributors, which is, I think, Oxford University Press, Diana. Now, do you have any, before we wrap up, do you have any final remarks or thoughts that you haven't covered? That?
Well, there's only one thing, actually, which was a sort of accidental discovery through the architecture that has struck me as an unusual observation about the difference, if you like. I mean, we've talked about similarities and borrowings, but there's one quite critical difference in terms of Christian architecture and Islamic architecture, which is to do with how the space is used. So I think I mentioned in the Cordoba Mesquita, it's like a sort of web, a network. You don't know where the beginning and the end is. You have this sort of sense of spatial uncertainty. And that is a very critical thing in Islamic architecture, because the philosophy seems to be that God is to be found in these spatial uncertainties. You know, as I mentioned, in nature, there's no perfect right angle. Everything is unique. And Islamic architecture seeks to create that. It models itself on nature. And there's a preference for sort of spaces like that, where there is no intermediary, if you like, between you and God. In Christian architecture, it's very different. And you have this sort of linear approach where there is a hierarchy. And I mentioned this very influential book, Celestial Hierarchies, which is meant to be modeled on the rituals, actually, of the early Syriac church. And Christian architecture, church and cathedral architecture, has grown up to reflect and represent these hierarchies. So you go into a church or a cathedral, you're in no doubt at all where the important people are meant to be. They're up at the front by the altar. There are sort of ranked seatings. There's the choir. There's the top clergy. Everybody has their place. And then there's the masses, you know, down through the nave, you know, far away. In a mosque, you know, which tends to be more circular, you don't have that. You know, there is no furniture. You can sit anywhere. There's this absence of hierarchy, and I find that actually rather refreshing, to be honest, in an approach to the space inside a building. And it's, you know, a lot to explore there, and I scratched the surface of it a bit in the book, but there's definitely a lot more that could be done on researching that as a topic.
Well, thank you very, very much, Diana, for speaking to the Middle East Institute today. That was utterly compelling. And, you know, I think it gives a very good idea as to the origins, a lot of the architecture that not only in Europe and also in the United States, as you so rightly pointed out. And to remember that this knowledge transfer, today we dealt with architecture, but was also happening with maths, astronomy, medicine, all sorts of forms of culture and civilization, you know, during this period. So you're right, this is scratching the surface, but it is a wonderful surface that you've been scratching, if I may say so. So thank you very much, everybody, today. Thank you very much for all your questions. If you haven't got answers to those questions, I very much believe you'll find them in the book, and I would recommend you go out and get it and buy it for your friends and family, perhaps as a Christmas present. Anyhow, I wish you all very well, and stay safe, and look forward to seeing you at future MEI events.